right, so we are discussing Chapter 2, Complex Societies in Southwest Asia and the Nile Valley from 3800 to 500 BC, or BCE, before Common Era. So I don't think I explicitly said this in Chapter 1, so I'm going to say it here in Chapter 2. Anytime that we don't have a recorded history, we call that prehistory. So we're getting into actual real history because we have written records and sources that we can use to study the past. So a lot of the early writings were usually histories that were written on some type of hard material like bone, shell, or stone. Later ancient writings survived because they were often reproduced. So although they're like the Egyptians, they're writing on papyrus, eventually those are so fragile though, than clay or other hard surfaces. So yes, they are using ink and papyrus, but in order to keep that written history, that written record, they will have to be recopied and rewritten over time. Let's see if I can get you an example. There we go. So this is clay letter written in cuneiform, and also the envelope that it came in. So here you can see like this would have protected it. This is the envelope, and then this is the actual tablet with cuneiform written on it. All these different slants and everything, these are different representations. These are different letters, if you will. So cities and the idea of civilization. So we're now into written history that we can actually recorded history, but civilization, it's not really just talking about a population formatted on political and social organization, but also particular ways of thinking and believing. Political boundaries were easier to determine than cultural boundaries, right? Like this is the city, this is that city within that boundary. That's easier than trying to put boundaries on different cultures. Historians consider the first locations that were able to develop writing in cities as the cradles of civilization. So let's talk about these cradles of civilization and the rise of states, laws, and social hierarchies that made up civilizations. So a particular family, religion, or individual within a state may gain the power and momentum to become the state's leader. Many states were established through violent means, sometimes using military force to overtake, therefore convincing the population to maintain a strong military force so that when those violent forces come in, we have a military to defend against them. Writing was used to keep track of a large population, and written records and laws identified guided systems of intended behaviors. Just like our written records and laws today, you're not supposed to go over the speed limit. That's a law that we have. And so it helps maintain the system of intended behavior. Laws tended to identify the social hierarchies through expected divisions of labor within the state. So we're going to kind of switch over, kind of knowing a little bit about written records and laws and hierarchies, but let's talk about Mesopotamia, from Sumer to Babylon. Right, so let's talk about some environmental challenges, irrigation, and religion. Seasonal floods and droughts were concerns for populations living in river valleys. Floods could bring in a new layer of topsoil, or they could drown the planted fields. Droughts, another environmental effect, would cause the crops to wither and the society's economic ability to die. Irrigation systems were developed to take water from the river and direct it deeper into the agricultural fields. This allowed the expansion of agriculture and agriculturally developed fields further away from a water source. Irrigation systems depended on the population's cooperation. Therefore, priests were placed in charge of running that system. Citizens needed to please the gods to ensure a bountiful harvest, making the priest the best choice to operate that system. The priests encouraged step pyramids, and they were really located in the center of the city. So especially think about like Mayan cultures in Central America. They have those step pyramids, right? You'll also see them like throughout the world. Everybody had step pyramids except for Egypt. They had the really unique pyramids. But think of those step pyramids located like in Mexico. That would be located in the center of the city. And the size of the temple, it also reflected the strength of that city. Kings and nobles held vast amounts of land that were worked by both free people who received crops and other goods for their labor, and they were also worked by slaves. So slaves in Sumer, one of the first civilizations that we talk about, they were under the direction of their owner, but they could make a profit through their own engagement in trade. So it's kind of different from the slavery that you're probably used to hearing about, slavery in the U.S. Mesopotamian society was patriarchal. That meant that it followed the father, with the older adult men holding the most power. Privileges for women depended on their connection to the aristocracy. Elite women had more opportunities than those of lower rank. Cuneiform was a system of writing developed in Sumer that used wedge-shaped symbols. We looked at cuneiform on that stone tablet earlier. Writing incorporated religion and the traditional stories of the heroes of the people. These compositions were called epic poems. Some epic poems include, if those of you that are familiar with the Bible, Genesis, that's an epic poem, which became the first book of the Old Testament, and also Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a really great epic poem, and Gilgamesh is a collection of Sumerian mythical stories. Building Sumerian cities required the scholars to study geometry and trigonometry to set them up properly, which they were really advanced cities that they were building. And then there is an empire within Mesopotamia, and that empire is created under Hammurabi. And he unifies Mesopotamia under military force and alliances with rulers of other smaller territories. But just to give you an idea of Sumerian writing, here we go. So you can see there's a symbol for star, there's the pictograph, the ideogram, and then the phonetic sign. Woman, you can see is the next one. Slave woman, mountain, water. So it's kind of interesting, right? Just to see like how it was, like the pictograph for it, like the symbol that represented the word, and then the phonetic signs. And we'll talk about the Phoenician alphabet and that stuff in a little bit. But to give you an idea about where we're talking about, we just talked about Mesopotamia. So this area here, kind of cool. And then we're also going to get into more Egyptian culture in this chapter as well in just a minute. So life under Hammurabi, that guy that we just mentioned 2 slides ago, that kind of consolidated and made an empire in Mesopotamia. So Hammurabi's code, he comes up with this code, and it's really like a list of rules, but it promoted the welfare of people by regulating behavior. Right? That's what rules and laws do. They regulate your behavior and set specific punishments for specific crimes. The code dealt extensively with agriculture, including the duties and rights of tenant farmers. The code also included regulations for marriage and other types of contracts between individuals. We're going to switch over and talk about what's going on with the Egyptians now, and the Nile and the God King. The Nile River's floods were not as destructive as those in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. The Nile River's floods brought extremely rich silt that replenished Egypt's agricultural topsoil. The Egyptian ruler, who was also known as Pharaoh, was a religious and a political leader who commanded wealth and resources from the people. The Egyptian religion was polytheistic, meaning that there was more than one god. The pharaoh was considered to be one among the Egyptian deities. So he's like God in human form, or a god in human form. The earliest of the Egyptian dynasties was identified as the Old Kingdom, which was the era when the Great Pyramids were constructed. Egyptians strongly believed in an afterlife, and they mummified the dead to preserve them for the journey into the spiritual world. The Egyptian ideas about death and the afterlife were preserved in a book called Book of the Dead. What about their society and work? Talked a little bit about their religion and their beliefs, but how did society and work? Egyptian writing was called hieroglyphs. It was a system of characters printed on sheets of papyrus or walls, and we'll look at some in just a minute. Most people in Egyptian society were farmers who seldom suffered from bad weather or crop failure. Egyptian marriages were arranged at a young age by the couple's families. Having sons, that's a priority for the Egyptian family. You can kind of see this is a patriarchy. We're going to pass down through the father. And labor obligations had people paying debts with products or service. Many may have been forced to work on the pyramids or canals in order to pay off those debts. The Hyksos, spelled right there for you, number 2 on this slide, but the Hyksos people moved into the Nile Delta during a series of famines and internal struggles and became rulers of Lower Egypt. And this time when they moved into the Nile and kind of took over during those famines and struggles, that era is known as the Middle Kingdom. So we talked about the Old Kingdom, now we're talking about the Middle Kingdom. The Hyksos brought bronze tools for farming, bronze weapons, and they also brought the horse-drawn chariot. Egyptians seeking to reunite Egypt sent armies and defeated the Hyksos rulers. The Egyptian victory over the Hyksos established the New Kingdom. The Hittites established an empire in the eastern Mediterranean region and would later confront those Egyptians. The Hittites spoke a language belonging to the Indo-European language group and were people who used iron weapons. Early confrontations between the Egyptians and the Hittites ended with an alliance that would lead to the exchange of ideas and prosperity. Basically, they signed this alliance because they realized we can't beat the other guy. So they decided for peace instead of battle. Here we go. So the Hittite homeland is here in this brown area, but this is their empire where all it covered. Going down into Syria. So remember, this is Mesopotamia and Hammurabi. The Old Kingdom is here in the darker green. And the Middle Kingdom kind of extending out from that. And then we have the New Kingdom. Notice where the kingdom is. It's all along the Nile River. This plays a very important role in Egyptian history. So remember, the Hittites brought iron, right? And so the Hyksos brought bronze, the Hittites bring iron. But during the Bronze Age collapse was a time of great disruption that also brought about the spread of new technology, iron, and new political entities. As Egyptian power began to decline, the strength of Nubia increased. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom occupied the northern regions of Nubia and incorporated it into the Egyptian empire. The Phoenicians had established their empire along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and the Phoenician culture and society was constructed of numerous city-states, each with its own king. The Phoenicians worked with metal and built a large grape wine industry. Their ships often carried wine for trade in nearby markets and kingdoms. The establishment of colonies involved the founding of the city-state of Carthage, located along the North African coast. The Phoenicians also established a phonetic system of writing that was based on an alphabet. So let's look at that really quickly. So these are hieroglyphs that the Egyptians used. And this could represent a word or a concept or an idea. So like this is throw stick. You'll notice the Phoenician for that, the Greek, and the Roman. Right? Water, the hieroglyph for water is kind of these waves, which kind of makes sense, right? That's kind of how we would do it as well. But you can see over time how these hieroglyphs and the representations, how they morph into the modern alphabet. So we just talked about where the Phoenicians were and kind of their empire and how it's spread out. You'll notice it's all along this North African coast. And a little bit into Spain as well, what will become Spain. So let's talk about another group, the Hebrews and the Hebrew state. So the Hebrews were traditionally nomadic sheep herders who at one time they were enslaved in Egypt. Remember, according to the Bible, Moses led the population out of Egyptian bondage in Exodus. They resettled in their ancient promised land and established the kingdom with Jerusalem as the capital. King Solomon built a large temple where the Ark of the Covenant and the Ten Commandments would be stored. And the Hebrews would be enslaved by the Babylonians and then liberated under the rule of King Cyrus the Great of Persia. So to give you an idea of where we're talking about, here's Israel, here's Judah, possible route coming out of Egypt, that Exodus, possible location of Mount Sinai, but then also this is Solomon's territory, or his kingdom, encompasses all of that area. So we have Hammurabi's Code. We've got kind of some other rules and laws that the Phoenicians followed, but what about the Jewish religion? So the covenant was a formal agreement between the Hebrew people and their God, Yahweh. The covenant was given to Moses in the form of the Ten Commandments. The covenant was the bond between the people and the God, which also became the basis for Hebrew law. Religious texts were held to be more important than Jewish religious leaders. Marriage and family were a fundamental part of Jewish life. Sons, just like in Egypt, sons were desired in order to pass on the ancestral family bloodline. The most important task for the Jewish population was to study the religious texts. The Assyrians were a Semitic people with a culture heavily influenced by the Babylonians. The Assyrian military developed the corps of engineers who built pontoon bridges for military troops. Assyrian kings organized conquered territories into an empire and made local leaders pay a tribute. The Assyrian power quickly fell under the Babylonians and the Medes. The Persian Empire was established by Cyrus the Great, who conquered the Medes not to slaughter or have them submit to slavery, but to unify and strengthen them as one empire. Cyrus defeated the king of Lydia, who then became his friend and advisor. Cambyses replaced his father, but was not well liked. Darius, a military leader, ruled after his death and attempted to spread the Persian Empire into Greece. Xerxes, who wanted to avenge his father's defeat by the Greeks, brought the Persian Empire to a war with the Greek city-states. To give you an idea of where we're talking about here, so the Assyrian homeland in Assyria, growth of the Assyrian Empire comes spreading out here and including some of these other empires. The Persian homeland is here, and then the growth of the Persian Empire. See how quickly or how large it grows. So just to give you kind of an overview, a summary of the chapter, about 5,000 years ago, people in some parts in the world invented writing. And that was, in order to meet the needs of the state. States first developed in the southern part of Mesopotamia, known as Sumer, and priests and rulers invented ways to control and organize people there. During the 3rd millennium, Egypt grew into a cohesive state under a single ruler, and then for long stretches of history, Egypt was prosperous and secure in the Nile Valley. During a period known as the New Kingdom, warrior kings created a large Egyptian empire, which is going to end up collapsing mainly because of environmental changes. After this, Nubian rulers of Kush conquered Egypt, and another group, the Phoenicians, came to dominate trade in the Mediterranean. Then we have another group called the Hebrews, and they created a new form of religious belief based on the worship of a single all-powerful God. In the 9th century, the Assyrians used a huge army and sophisticated military tactics to create an empire from a base in northern Mesopotamia. The Persians established an even larger empire. And the Persians generally allowed their subjects to continue their own customs, traditions, and religion. So kind of looking ahead, we're going to look at some more, we'll look at these groups like the land and its first settlers. When we're looking at Indian society, we'll talk about the Aryans during the Vedic age. So we will be moving into talking more about India, kind of going across the subcontinent of India and learning about life and how it started and kind of the establishment of Indian culture as we move forward in time.